Hello, Hannah. I just read your message that you literally just came across my work an hour ago. That's crazy. You're writing a lecture on the aesthetics of the sublime. I'm actually going to talk a little bit about the sublime tonight. So that will be interesting to hear your thoughts if you want to comment. I'm going to talk about the Kantian sublime a little tiny bit. So I'm just making sure I can see everything. Yep. Yep, there are a few people watching live. Sometimes I pre-record these and just put them up on the first Sunday of the month. Sometimes I do it live and just wanted to do it live tonight. Okay, while people are coming in, hello Tim and Kate and Andrew. There must be things I have to tell you. There are things I have to tell you. The first is, it's probably too late for most people now, but I'm doing my 2 retreats in October. So there's only a couple of spaces left. If you're interested, go onto my website. I'm doing Spark, which is really a place where you spend 5 days in this place called the Crawfordsburn Inn that most of you know about, to really start paying attention to your repetitions and your symptoms. Simone Weil talks about the difference between will and attention. That will is what gets us from one place to another, and that's what we do in life. We move from one place to another. We try to get from A to B. We don't have a book. We want to write a book. We want to go out. Whatever it is, will and counselling and life coaching is all about that. Attention is about not doing, but rather being attentive to your, not simply your actions, but your symptoms, the aspects of your life that you aren't usually aware of, how patterns emerge in your work life and in your relational life and with your family members, times where you maybe get upset for no reason whatsoever or angry at a very small thing, and maybe you've never really worked out why that is. Spark is a place where you have space to reflect on those repetitions with the hope of hearing what they have to say and potentially draining them of their enjoyment so that they can be navigated differently. So that's Spark. And then there's a leadership retreat for people who are interested in taking some of the ideas of radical theology and bringing them into groups and churches and congregations. So that's all happening in October. Another thing I want to tell you about is I used to run a thing called the non-membership course. And I remember I started this it must be 30 years ago now, and it was designed to kind of do like a 12-week course on the basics of what I'm doing with Pyrotheology. And I called it a non-membership course because by the time you finished it, you would get a little card, this little card. And this little card, personally signed, says that, in fact I can read it, says, this person is not a member of, nor in good standing with, the Pyrotheology Club. The enclosed coin, well, I didn't have a coin at the time, we'll come back to that, but the enclosed coin should be carried at all times in the event that said individual is ever accused of having associations with Pyrotheology. So you did this so that you became a non-member. And the idea was not to tell you what to think, but to create a space to think and to engage. And it was kind of playful. But then I developed these coins, and you get a little coin when you do the non-membership. Anyway, we do an online version of this occasionally where my friend Kate, who is online at the moment, will facilitate a live Zoom conversation, often maybe around either something I've written or someone else has written that connects with some of the things that we explore. And it's a real place for introductory questions and conversations. And Kate is doing a 2-week reading group, non-membership reading group, on an article I wrote for Everyday Analysis. Everyday Analysis, a lot of you know about, it's a great little organization that publishes these pamphlets that are psychoanalytic and philosophical in nature, and it's a very grassroots kind of thing. And there's a few organizations that I am friendly with that are friends of ours, and Everyday Analysis is one of them. Philosophy Portal is another. The guys at Underground Theory are always doing really interesting things. They're great. So there are a few of these people. Sublation magazine are really interesting. So Everyday Analysis is one of them. And this is a 2-week reading group. And it's on Saturday the 14th, and then the next Saturday, which is the 21st. Yes, 21st. You'll all get a copy of the article. That's for anybody on my Patreon. And so wanted to let you know about that, especially if you want a place where you can just ask any questions, go through that article. It's the most recent thing that I've written. That's the thing to do. Have I got anything else? I don't want to do too much housekeeping. I just want to say hello and thanks for joining me. It's great to see you in a virtual way. We did a little group last night where we talked about Total Recall, the 1990 classic, so that was really fun. And next Sunday, I'll be facilitating a Zoom conversation on this very talk that you're listening to right now, wherever you are in the world. Okay, so what do I want to look at tonight? So as some of you know, I'm kind of writing, after taking a decade off, I'm writing a new book, and I'm on chapter 7 of that book. It's in 3 sections. The 3 sections are Nothing Lives, Nothing Binds, and Nothing Saves, which is covered in the Pyrotheology Temple article that the non-membership course is going to be looking at. I don't know if I gave you the title. It's called the Pyrotheology Temple, right? So it's split into 3 sections, and it's a really good summary, actually, of the book that I'm writing. The first section, Nothing Lives, is about this idea of lack that dwells within us, and I explore those ideas. The second section, which is Nothing Binds, is the idea that what unifies us, you to me, me to you, and us to everything, is that we share nothing in common, right? I saw a meme once that said, a dating app for nihilists, and it said, for those with nothing in common, right? So that's basically what Nothing Binds means, is that actually what we're unified on is fundamentally not shared language or gender or race or interest in philosophy or sports. We create communities around shared interests, and that's great. But communion is a social bond formed and forged around a shared negation. That we all are desiring subjects of language, subjects of lack. And then the third section of the book is Nothing Saves. And that's the section where I guess I get really into kind of the work that I'm interested in, both theoretically in terms of what this looks like in a religionless way, in a kind of like a let's say religious way for the sake of argument, but also what it looks like in terms of liturgy, in terms of a group that gathers around this shared lack. So that's the book. Each section has 3 chapters. This might all change by the time it comes out, by the way, but this is how it's currently structured. 3 sections, 3 chapters, very dialectic, obviously. And chapter 7, which is what I'm working on now, is where I'm basically comparing and contrasting what I'm doing by putting it alongside 2 other ways of thinking about the absolute or God, and 2 different ways of understanding religious experience, and 2 different ways of understanding what liturgy is. So I'm going to give you just a brief summary of, and this is very informal, just of what I'm writing in that. I hope that it helps clarify this project that many of us have been on for. I mean, some of you who are watching this or will be watching this have been journeying with me for 20 years. And then we have Hannah here who's less than 60 minutes. So we've got a large span right there. But yes, this might kind of, I think, bring into sharper focus what I'm trying to do with this idea of church of the contradiction. And the videos that I've been working on recently, they're almost done. So I've got some videos that many of you know I've been working on that include Helen, Julie Reich, Duke Special, Padre Gutuma. So all got together and we created these visual expressions of what this liturgy of lack might look like. Okay, so I was going to start, I'm going to still do this, right, and see if this works. I want to start briefly by talking about the difference between demand, desire, and drive. And I'm going to try to map what I'm saying onto that a little bit. It won't work completely, and I'll maybe, I'll say where I think it doesn't work. But basically, you can think of three types of want that are going on simultaneously within us. And in psychoanalysis, this is, I think, very, very well thought through. And they're called different things, but usually demand, desire, and drive are pretty much right. Demand, sometimes people call that need or whatever, but I like everything beginning with the same letter. So demand is really what you see most purely in an infant. A demand is you have a need for water or for food, for warmth, for sleep. Very basic want that has an object that can satisfy it. So that's the most basic type of want. You want an object and you cry, and if you're lucky, you receive that object and you're satisfied. Now, often that's all people think a desire is. We want something, we want an object, we seek it out, we try to, kind of watch self-help videos or whatever to help us get what we want, whatever it is, a partner or a movie deal or an ability to bake a cake or play tennis or whatever it is, and we want that object, we get it, and we're satisfied. But most of us know that we're a lot more complicated than that. So the second level we can talk about is desire. And again, I know we've covered this before, so I'm just going quickly, but desire is not so much for an object, but is often a good way of thinking about it is desire is for a lost object. You can think of the original lost object being the mother. Mother is the name of God on every child's lips. There's a sense of loss that we have, most of us, whenever we separate from the mother other. We say there are exceptions to this whenever in, say, autism, where the symbiosis doesn't seem to have held, or in psychosis where separation doesn't occur in a clean way. But when we, in a sense, individuate and start seeing ourselves as separate, as other, we can feel that we've lost something. And again, very simply speaking, we can think of everything as a substitute then, right? So almost it's like a third comes in, the paternal function, and says, well, you can't stay at your mother's breast forever, but you can win a prize for running a race. There you go, right? So you have to now get a substitute pleasure, and the substitute pleasure is public enjoyment, not private enjoyment, but public enjoyment. If you think about it like private enjoyment might be reading a book, and public enjoyment is you taking an Instagram video of you reading the book, right? So you get the substitute enjoyment of people thinking that you're enjoying reading the book. And to a certain extent, there's nothing wrong with that, because that's what desire is. There is no real private enjoyment. There's lots of good stories around that. I won't tell any stories, but the idea that we like to think that we don't care about the other, that we just privately want to enjoy, but that's lost to us. We're in the world of symbolic enjoyments, and that's brilliant because it means that we have to interconnect with each other. I care what you think, and you care what I think. Maybe not literally you and I, but you care about other people, what other people think. And so in some respects, desire is always a bit futile. It can seem depressing, right? Is that you never get back to the purity of that private enjoyment. Little moments when it feels amazing or whatever, but generally we desire mimetically. We move from one thing to another, to another, to another, feeling rarely very satisfied at all. And this keeps us going. This creates creativity. I mean, if we were all... This is called the incest taboo, by the way, in anthropology, where there is a taboo against staying in the private enjoyment of the parental private enjoyment. So you have to kind of go out and do something in the world, and hence we have microphones and computers and all of that, again, to simplify. But that's desire. So desire never gets satisfied. So demand is for an object, desire is for the lost object. And then the most interesting of all, which is drive. And drive is for loss itself as an object. So as I say, we've got demand for an object, desire for a lost object, drive is for loss itself as the object. And that means, in short, that there's a dimension of us that wants not having, that wants a type of failure, a type of impossibility, a type of struggle, a type of sacrifice. This is not simply something that some people struggle with, like anorexia or gambling, where for the gambler, losing becomes the addictive thing, not the winning. The losing is somehow what it is that connects them. Or in anorexia, there's a lack of eating. But there's a sense in which those are extreme cases of something that is within us all, when you can only desire someone who's under threat of being taken away, so you have to be jealous. Or you can only desire someone who's impossible to get, and as soon as you get them, your desire kind of dissipates. These are all different ways in which impossibility plays out in our lives. The difficulty is this is unconscious. When we get to drive, we get to the unconscious, and in a very precise way, it's unconscious because we can never consciously want lack. The perverse structure is maybe the closest to that, but even then, it's complicated. So, ultimately, you could say at a conscious level, we're all utilitarians, right? At a conscious level, we all want to maximize our pleasure and minimize our pain. But right behind our backs, we are getting enjoyment out of self-sabotage, out of failures, out of creating problems from ourselves. Like, for example, when a very famous actress steals clothes from a fashion store. She doesn't have to do it. She's got all the money she needs. Why? She's sabotaging herself by, doing this crime. Or it kind of manifests in lots of different ways. And the issue is not to get rid of this drive, but rather to orient oneself around it well. A great example of this is in Ireland. If ever you come to Ireland, if you ever come to Wake Festival or anything like that, you'll know that in Ireland we have a very sophisticated grammar around the buying of drinks. And it's very complicated for anyone who's not from here. I have my great friend Jay has come to Ireland many times, and I've tried to explain to him how buying drinks works, because for the first couple of times he came here, he didn't buy any drinks. He said, the Irish are so generous, they're just always buying me drinks. And I was like, well, no, but you have to buy drinks back occasionally, right? Especially when you're a guest, of course, people buy rounds, but then occasionally you have to buy a round back. And he says, okay, when do you do that? And I was like, okay, well, you kind of keep a vague eye on it. You don't have to do it on the same night, but like if you've got like 3 or 4 drinks for free, and there's 3 or 4 people gathered one night, you buy the round. And he said, well, what if I've got less money than the other people? And I was like, well, then what happens is people will say no. They'll say, oh no, I don't need a drink, right? And they'll wait for a few minutes and then they'll go and get a drink. And then he said, okay, and what happens if you don't drink alcohol? And suddenly what I realized was this, you could write an encyclopedia about how subtle this this sacrifice occurs that creates a social bond, but it's something that we all know from Ireland, right? So we can navigate it very, very well. But it is a navigation around sacrifice, around gift, around something that's not economic, right? So there's a loss and there's a lack that's going on, that's creating the social bond within the bar. If you had a society where everything was exchange, there was no gift giving, going to a party, you didn't bring a gift, after having food at your parents' house, getting out your wallet and giving some money to your mum, whatever it is, this would be the collapse of the social order, because the social order requires sacrifice, it requires lack. So this idea of lack is not negative or positive. It's part of what it is to be a creature of desire and a creature of language. And it can be the thing that destroys us, and it can be the thing that inspires us. And so it's the best and the worst. So those three things I want to just put out there, because I'm going to loosely talk about religions of demand, religions of desire, and I want to talk about religions of drive. So, religion of demand would be the idea, in a way, that there is the absolute God is out there as a supreme being. I'm going to do a good example of these, not bad examples, good examples. So there's a hyper presence, a reality out there that we can encounter that can satisfy us in some sort of way. The most powerful form of this idea is in mysticism. This is where my three things work least, so I'm going to problematize this in a second. But if you think about the mystics, someone like Julian of Norwich, or a contemporary thinker like Jean-Luc Marion, you have this idea that religious experience is a saturation experience. We are short-circuited by the overwhelming over-proximity of a hyper-reality. Jean-Luc Marion calls this counter-experience, because it's not an experience as such. It's a short-circuiting. It's an overwhelming awe that kind of is too much to grasp. And this is where the sublime comes in. So this is a very Kantian idea. So in the Kant's notion of the sublime, it is an encounter with something that overwhelms our conception and our ability to intuit, our ability to, what's his terms for this? Intuition and sensory sensory overload in a way. Now he had two notions of the sublime. He called the mathematical sublime and the dynamic sublime. The mathematical sublime is when you're overwhelmed by something in the mind. So like infinity, thinking about what infinity is kind of overwhelming. You can have a concept of eternity, and you can have a concept of infinity, or you can have a concept of the number pi, but you're in a way having a concept of something that cannot be conceptualized. So it's kind of, when you really think about it, you can be overwhelmed. And then the dynamic sublime is more bodily. It's like in the midst of a great storm, feeling the tremor and the power of nature, and feeling the awe of being overwhelmed and the anxiety that comes from an experience that is too much. Now, this is connected to the early Freud's notion of trauma. A trauma, the original idea of trauma, seduction theory, was that a trauma is an overwhelming happening that the child cannot symbolize. You cannot put it into words. You can't alphabeticize it. So it happens to you, but it's a too muchness, right? And so in the mystical tradition, the religious experience is a counter experience of saturation, a traumatizing event, in that it cannot be symbolized, alphabeticized. It is undergone. It is blinding. If you take that hymn that says, I once, Amazing Grace, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, I once was lost and now I'm found, was blind but now I can see. In Church of the Contradiction, we've turned that around and we say, I once was found but now I'm lost, could see, and now am blind. And there's something in the mystical tradition that would take that on, that there is not a blinding light, but a blinding night. And it's a kind of revelatory darkness. Very beautiful understanding, and if you read someone like Rudolf Otto, it's very, very beautiful description. So in this approach, when you have God, the name God is a name for that which cannot be named, right? In this mystical tradition, and Anselm is key, Anselm defines God, the signifier God, as a signifier that defines what is beyond signification. And that's what's called a master signifier. Similar to what we would say about justice and love and freedom, there are these signifiers that signify something that we cannot signify, but basically the biggest master signifier is the word God, because in the very definition of God for Anselm, just like the very definition of a triangle is like three-sided shape or whatever, the very definition of God is that which is beyond our ability to conceive. And Anselm's argument why is because if you could conceive of something greater than God, like God is that which you cannot conceive of greater, right? So he starts off with that. He says, what is God? Whether you believe in God or not, that signifier references that than which none higher can be thought or conceived. And then he says, so if you can conceive of something greater than conception, and God is conceivable, and you're thinking about something greater than God, and that's impossible. God is that than which none greater can be conceived. So he says God must be that which is greater than conception, because that's the greatest thing you can think of. The greatest thing I can think of is something beyond my ability to think. Anyway, that is actually, in the tradition of the mystics. Pseudo-Dionysius and others have this notion of God. Anselm was just the one who put it into the most systematic form in the Proslogion. So you have that notion of God. Then you have the notion of religious experience as the overwhelming saturation of the mind and the body by this, and say in Rudolf Otto's The Idea of the Holy, I think he says at the start of that book, if you haven't had this experience, you're not going to enjoy the book, right? So don't bother, and that's quite a mystical approach, which is not arguing for or against the existence of God, but rather going like, have you had this counter experience or not? For people who have had the counter experience, they probably cannot help but think that they have encountered something that is greater than being, right? And if you haven't had it, then you're probably not, right? So the mystics don't really go in for the kind of philosophical arguments for or against God. So this experience is one that happens very occasionally to some people, and maybe it happens to everybody occasionally, that you feel overwhelmed in this way. It's not just being overwhelmed by a beautiful piece of art or by an event that is like a sinking of the Titanic, if you're on it, like it's an overwhelming event. This is overwhelming in a multitude of ways. And Jean-Luc Marion uses Kant to say that Kant basically outlined a series of categories that everything is filtered through, called quantity, quality, relationality, and modality. These are the four kind of like categories that everything that we encounter goes through these four filters. And basically Marion says the religious experience overwhelms all four, right? That's the argument. And you can go look it up, talk to ChatGPT about it. Very good. I've been doing that recently. ChatGPT is quite impressive these days. So religious experience happens occasionally, and it's a sublime experience in that Kantian sense of being overwhelmed. And then a religious liturgy would be one that invites this encounter. So I think the charismatic church is an example of this in a way, is like where you invite this overwhelming counter experience to occur, and the results should be, humility and desire to go into the world or whatever. Right? Um, so that's one. And I connect that loosely with demand, in that there is an object God, now a hyper object, but that can meet us and can kind of satisfy us in some way. The reason why I hesitate is because someone like Jean-Luc Marion would say that because it's a saturated phenomenon, there is a dissatisfaction in it. Like there's a mystery and an unknowingness. So it doesn't quite give you everything, and it gives you too much. And by giving you too much, it evokes doubt and unknowing and longing and yearning. So it's a little bit more complicated, but I still think it's loosely we can call it the religion of demand. There is an object God, there is an encounter with this plentitude. Then I want to go on to religion of desire. And for this I want to talk about Paul Tillich. I think Paul Tillich's really, really good on this. For him, God is not some hyper being, hyper presence. God is the name of the ground of being. And when he uses that term, what he means is the ground out of which everything arises, including subject and object, being and non-being. So you can't talk about God as an object or even a subject, an entity. In a way, that signifier, the signifier God, signifies, basically you could say signifies what existed before the Big Bang. And you can't even say exist, because even that word doesn't work. The singularity, right? The singularity before the singularity erupts. And when Paul Tillich, uses the word God to signify this singularity before existence and non-existence, objectivity and subjectivity, etc., then there's no way to encounter this. I'll say that for a second. There's no way of encountering this. So the religious experience is not an experience of plentitude and of being overwhelmed by some object that you encounter, but rather is the experience of not having, right? So for Paul Tillich, religious experience is what he calls ultimate concern. It's a yearning. Now, it might be a yearning for truth, it might be a yearning for beauty, it might be a yearning for justice, but it is the sense in which there is something, and this is very closely connected to Derrida and post-structuralism. There is what Derrida called an undeconstructible, right? There's something about, say, justice. We'll take justice, that we can never name. And if we ever think we have justice, if we ever think we've created a completely just or a completely democratic system, then that will become totalitarian, because in a way, what Derrida says is justice is always to come. Democracy is always to come. There's an eschatological dimension to freedom, to justice, to love, to democracy. And when we think we have a society where we've enacted it, we've embodied it, we've incarnated it, we are fooling ourselves, because similar to the mystics, these are master signifiers. These are terms that promise something that they never fully deliver on, that's always in the future, that's always to come. And so for Paul Tillich, and we all have ultimate concern for Paul Tillich. It's hard to find sometimes, and it comes out, he would say, in demonic ways. So for him, if justice is rendered into an object, right? We say my nation is just. So you take that abstract notion justice and you say this political party embodies what justice is. He would say that's idolatrous and that's demonic, because you're taking something infinite and you're reducing it to the finite. Justice can be seen within parties, but it is always more than, right? And so the purpose of the liturgy is to prevent you from falling into demonic ultimate concern, demonic religious experience, to stop you from thinking that some political party, some political leader, some group has the answer, and that's idolatry, has it in their hand. but rather the liturgy is there to help salt your thirst, to help you yearn for truth, for beauty, for justice, to work towards those. So the philosopher is driven by truth. You know, the lawyer, the activist might be driven by justice. The artist is driven by beauty. But the liturgy is designed to help realize that the kingdom of God is always there and yet to come. There is an eschatological dimension. And religious experience in this is universal, always happening to everybody. So in the first example, I said religious experience is what happens to some people sometimes. You go up into the mountains, you take ayahuasca, you take psilocybin, you go to a charismatic meeting, you have the experience, and you can name it, you can write it down, you can say it happened on this day at this time. Right? That's kind of like the mystical experience. But for Tillich, religious experience is happening to everyone all the time, and it is the experience of yearning, the experience of desire, the experience of a lost object that you can never get. And why can you never get it? Because the signifier God signifies the ground of being. The ground of being can never be grasped, but rather the ground of being opens up the desire to grasp. Now, on that, what's interesting about Tillich, and this is why Thomas Altizer, who's a radical theologian, he said Paul Tillich opened the door to radical theology but didn't walk through the door. Because if the first example of saturation, the mystical tradition, embodies a sense of unknowing that comes from hyper-presence, so there's unknowing in that comes from hyper-presence. Paul Tillich, there's an unknowing that comes from an absence, right? So there's a certain unknowing and doubt and never having that comes from never being able to get the object. You've come out of the ground of being, just like we come from the mother's womb, right? So we come out of the ground of being and we can never go back. And we are therefore yearning and desiring in the world, never able to return to the ground of being, but showing our connection to that ground of being through our desire for truth and justice and beauty. And maybe liberation theology could see as fits in there or whatever. But Paul Tillich's notion is not quite a drive. So for me, that's religion of desire. Right? See, if you see where I'm going, religion of demand, religion of desire. By the way, if you think this is not going to work, you can let me know because the chapter's still being written. Right? But what I'm interested in, I don't even think we've got, sadly, the religions of desire yet, but I'm really interested in what can be called religion of drive. And what a religion of drive is the idea that lack and unknowing and doubt is not the result necessarily of hyper-presence, nor of the fact that we can never connect with the ground of being. We can never connect with this thing that we call the absolute or God. But rather that in the lack itself is where we connect with the absolute, right? Because the absolute is self-divided. We are divided. We have lack within us. We are creatures of desire, creatures who can never be satisfied with some object. But, and I think I said this at the beginning, is that drive, you're satisfied by the lack, right? So in desire, you're never fully satisfied, right? You always feel a wee bit dissatisfied. In drive, when you in a sense are able to make space for drive, you can directly enjoy your not having. You can directly enjoy your sacrifice. You can directly enjoy gift, which is giving without a return, right? A pure loss. And a religion of drive, and when I say that this doesn't exist, it does. It exists everywhere all the time throughout human history. But an institution of drive religion, I don't think exists yet. A denomination of death drive. doesn't quite exist. I think it's always at work, because drive is always at work. But the denomination of death drive, which is what I'm calling this talk, is a liturgy that directly enjoys unknowing and lack, and sees that in that embrace we connect with the absolute. So I'm going to say a couple more things about that, and then if you've got any questions, stick them in. I should have said this at the beginning, but if you put a Q before you put the question, then I can probably see it more easily. But hey, why is this connected to Christianity? Is that what I want to talk about? Oh, yes. It's connected to this notion of the death of God, right? Now, the death of God is connected, obviously, with this crucifixion of Christ image that we have, right? Which is very, very important and central. But within radical theology of someone like Thomas Altizer, this crucifixion is itself a mythological retelling, or a kind of a reenactment of the original death of God. And we see this in Simone Weil. So I'll talk about Simone Weil for a second, but she's almost similar to Paul Tillich, right? Imagine, here's a creation myth, right? So before the beginning, we cannot really speak of what this singularity is, right? So in this mythological language, someone like Simone Weil says, well, what's the first thing that's created? And for Weil, she says, well, the singularity, this is before space and time, or when all space and all time are collapsed, right? So everything is collapsed, right? Well, the first thing that's created has to be nothingness itself, right? So the first thing that you have to create in order to create the universe is the space for the universe to be, right? Space and time. And so what's interesting about this is it's the idea of what Freud would call a primary narcissism, right? Is that a contraction. The singularity has to contract into itself in order to create space for nothing. And then out of that nothing, the universe to arise. And it's a beautiful analogy, because this happens, if you think about it in terms of an infant. An infant, in order to become a self, engages in what's called primary narcissism, right? Which is where you contract into yourself and you start to be concerned about you, right? You're not just immersed in the mother other, you see yourself and you're brought into yourself. And narcissism is very closely connected to the idea of evil, which we'll talk about now, in a second, is because if you think of what morality is empathy. Morality is my connection and my wovenness into the other, taking into consideration the other's needs and desires. And when I am in pain, so one of Freud's central insights is narcissism is always connected to pain. Everyone's a narcissist when they hit their little finger with a hammer, right? You do not care about Ukraine, you do not care about Gaza, you do not care about anything when you hit your finger with a hammer. You're a pure narcissist. You're thinking that your little finger is more important than world politics and what's happening, right? We can't help it. You can't help it. You know, your finger is so sore. And, you know, the Nazis did horrific experiments designed to see how the social bond could be broken, where they would have family members having to take electric shocks or give them to their children, right? So the idea was, at what point can you put someone through so much suffering that you break the bond with the loved one, the other? And that's kind of an example, and it's a horrible example, but of how pain brings us inward into ourselves, and then empathy and love is what weaves us into the other. But there's a story in which, for Freud, there's what's called a primary narcissism, as in we have to have that contraction in order to create a space between us. And then that allows for morality, that allows for us to overcome narcissism by reconnecting with the other, but with a sense of self. And you can see this in the creation myth of Simone Weil, where the first thing God has to do is the act of evil, right? The act of contraction into itself. And this is how you can connect with the idea of evil and is part of creation, etc., etc. So there's this contraction inward that creates a space for nothingness itself, and therefore for this reconnection. So, the reason why I'm saying all of that, sorry, is because that means the death of God is the very first act of God, right? In this creation story, the very first thing that the Absolute does is die. And the death of the Absolute is the formation of the universe. And therefore, what we see in the Christological example is a retelling of the death of God in history. And the liturgy, which is the liturgy of the Church of the Contradiction, is a liturgy that invites people to participate in the death of God in their own subjective life. So the death of God isn't something that happens at a certain point in the history of the cosmos. In some respects, the death of God is the cosmos itself. It is the very first act of creation. As I say, then it is enacted in history. That's the Hegelian idea. And the Church of the Contradiction, the denomination of drive, is the space in which, through music and comedy and cabaret and exposition and poetry and other forms of art, this death of God is something that we invite into ourselves. And that's why I call it communion. A communion is a meal gathered around a shared loss, the death of God, right? So communion is a meal around the death of God. And so the Church of the Drive, the denomination of the Drive, is a place in which we enact communion, so that when we enter into the world, we can obviously create communities and we'll have identities that we share with some people, etc., but at a more fundamental level, when we see the other, we will realize that they are other to us, we are other to them, they are other to them, and we are other to ourselves. And that otherness is what we share with each other, and that otherness has resonance with this notion of the death of God. So in summary, this is only going to be a very informal talk. I feel I've got quite deep. But there's the mystical tradition. The Absolute is a hyper-presence. Religious experience is a counter experience of saturation that happens occasionally. The liturgy is designed to invite that experience and the humility that comes from it. In the second one, the Absolute is the ground of being. Religious experience is desire, is loss, is something that can never be fulfilled, but we're always already caught up in religious experience. And the liturgy is designed to ensure that that religious experience does not become demonic in form and idolatrous. And then in radical theology, you have God as a self-divided absolute, or as negativity itself. You have religious experience as privation, as the enjoyment and the embrace of a lack that is within us all and within the universe. And the liturgy is designed to help you embrace that lack in a way that will rob it of its deathly sting. Okay, yes, I'll stop there and see if anybody has any questions. Thank you for bearing with me. That was longer than I expected. Let's see, I'm just going through. Lots of people saying hello, hi. Let's see. Oh, yes. Wesley, hello. I like that you're here listening. It's good. You're saying, Jesus God, he appeared to you all 7 times and he told you to tell the vision. I'm not sure what that means, but I appreciate you letting me know. And you went. Goodbye. All right. That would have been quite fun to hear more. There's Chris. Hey, Chris. I went looking for an equivalent of the peak mystical experience in a few evangelical charismatic churches, but was disappointed. I'd have taken them working for a few people I'd have taken them working for a few people I was close to as well. I'm not sure, but yes, funny enough, Chris, because I was a charismatic for a bit, I was round the Toronto Blessing time, which I'm sure you'll know about, and so I luckily, that's where I experienced those kind of mystical things. So I think yours happened more privately than mine, but yeah, mine was actually in the charismatics. Oh yeah, sorry, you kept going with the next comment. This is the annoying thing, you can only put 280 characters in, so it's hard to put your entire thought in the chat box, so I understand the frustrations. Didn't seem to be able to have peak mystical experience directly. I suspect the charismatics are going for something slightly different, something ecstatic but not mystical as such. I get what you're saying, Chris, and it's funny because I like the charismatics in some ways because for me there is an element of the mystical there, but I don't. But maybe I'm being generous on that. But I was part of a community here like 30 years ago, more, and they definitely embraced what at least is in, I think, some sort of continuity with the mystical tradition. But I think so. But at the same time, I suppose what I'm interested in, Chris, is institutional forms. And obviously the mystics don't really have any institutional form of this. Neither does Tillich. Neither do we. But I would go like, so if I had to pick some institutional form of the mystics, I'll go for the charismatics. Chris Young. Oh, great meeting you. Hey, Chris, it was great meeting you as well. I hope you're enjoying the tour. If it's the same Chris that I'm thinking of, who's touring at the moment, was coming through Belfast and we hung out. Here's a question. Catherine, can you speak to how the Church of Contradiction relates to anxiety? Oh, brilliant. Or the alleviation of anxiety as we trudge through this age of anxiety? Thank you, Catherine. That's a great question. Yeah. So I kind of follow Kierkegaard here and others that in a way, anxiety is the most important affect, and Lacan says the same. He says it's the only one that doesn't lie. So we can be happy, we can think we're happy when we're sad, or we can think we love someone when we don't, and we can think we don't love someone when we do. Our emotions lie to us just as much as our thoughts. But for someone like Kierkegaard, anxiety always tells the truth, because anxiety for him is the evidence of our contradiction, our self-alienation. Now, for Kierkegaard, maybe less for him and more for Kant, right? There's this idea that going on within us, right? Spinoza said this actually, right? Spinoza said this, but he didn't see the contradiction, is that there's two types of cause and effect. There's physical cause and effect, one billiard ball hits another, and there's a chain reaction. And then there's mental cause and effect, which is an idea 2 + 2 = 4. Right? So they're both cause and effect. There's intellectual cause and effect, which is logic, and there is physical cause and effect. And for someone like Kant, to be human is to have both of those going on inside you at the same time. We are animals, so beasts are physical cause and effect, you could say. The beasts of the earth are kind of going along in relation to their instincts, physical cause and effect. And if we imagine AI or angels you could think of as being caught up in rational cause and effect, pure beings of mind, right? And both of these are deterministic, right? So if you're purely physically determined, that's deterministic. If you're purely determined by reason, that's deterministic as well. For Kant, because we have both going on at the same time, they kind of short-circuit each other, they get in the way of each other, and the subject, who we are, is the short circuit of these two different types of cause and effect going on within us. And we all know this whenever we think, I know what I should do in this situation, but I want to do this. Right? We can feel this conflict, and anxiety, for Kierkegaard, is in a way the name for the fact that we're not on rails, that we don't know what we should do. And that's why Jean-Paul Sartre said that anxiety is the evidence of our freedom, and why he said we're condemned to freedom, because we don't experience freedom as a good thing, like it's anxiety producing. And Kierkegaard also called this spirit. Spirit is the contradiction that we are. So, sorry, I'm saying all of that to go, anxiety from this tradition is evidence of your humanity. It's evidence of your freedom. It's evidence of your subjectivity. But in an age of anxiety, and I'll add one thing that Lacan brings in. So for the existentialists, anxiety is the evidence of your freedom. It's like, I don't know what I should do, right? That's what anxiety is. You go to a party, you think you said the wrong thing or whatever, and you feel anxious the next day about how you acted. Lacan, I think, goes another step deeper and says fundamentally anxiety is not an affect that comes out purely because of your freedom, that you don't know what you should do and you feel that anxiety. Ultimately, anxiety arises because you don't know what the other wants. It's like the other's desire. How do I fit in with the big other? When I go to that party and I act what I think is in a bad way, it's like, what do the others expect of me? How should I act in relation to your gaze at me? So anxiety is all about not knowing how to act, not knowing how we fit in society, not knowing how we fit with others. And this idea is that then anxiety cannot be overcome. You can't overcome anxiety. But what you can learn to do, and this is what analysis does and what we can do in community. It's not easy, but we can learn to embrace our anxiety and eventually enjoy our anxiety. This connects directly with this talk, because in this talk I'm trying to say that drive is connection to enjoying your lack. That's directly connected to anxiety, because anxiety is the affective lack of not knowing what you should do and not knowing how you fit in. So the Church of the Contradiction is a place where you very gradually, through the use of music and comedy and poetry and spoken word of various kinds, you are able to embrace your anxiety. You're able to enjoy that experience. And actually the Barbie movie is a good example of this, because in the Barbie movie, the other name for this is hysteria. So the hysteric never feels at one with themselves. Do I love this person? Do I not? Am I in the right job? Am I not? Am I an imposter in my work? I don't feel that I'm really a teacher, right? So the hysteric is the one who feels themselves divided. And in the movie Barbie, the Barbie dolls find freedom when they embrace their dividedness. So I think near the end of the movie, they start to kind of see that they're playing multiple contradictory roles. And when they kind of embrace this and put it into words, then they wake up, right? And the book that I'm writing, I was going to call it The Hysterical God, because the argument in the book is that the hysteria is in everything, right? And so that's anxiety. So it's about not overcoming it, but embracing it and finding a way to that's almost the religious experience of the Church of the Contradiction, is anxiety itself, which is the universal affect. I'll just do a couple more, because I know I don't want to take all your time, but you can come back and watch it another time if you need to do other things. Rich says, is the narcissistic move essentially denomination? Oh, denaming. Oh, that's an interesting question. So Rich is referring to, I should have done this play. I realized when I used the word denomination, to denomination obviously means a church group, but to denominate means to dename. So you nominate, you name, and you denominate, you dename, you unname. And this talk has been about what we cannot name and what we have to unname. And the mystics and Paul Tillich and the radical theologians, they're all doing a type of denaming. So I like that play on words. The narcissistic move, a form of denomination, denaming. I don't know, I'm not sure if I would use that term, but I would say in relation to narcissism, the reason why I find this interesting to use that word is we're doing a book study on my Patreon of a book called Godhead and the Nothing by Altizer, and he basically argues that the death of God is this contraction, and this contraction is evil, because the contraction is a going into yourself. But he says it's a necessary evil, right? It's a Felix culpa. It's a fortunate fall, right? It's an original sin. It has to happen. It's an original contraction that has to occur. So primary narcissism is basically the Freudian term for original sin. It's a necessary moving in order then to go out into the world and reconnect. So, Rich, you might be onto something. Let me think about that a little bit more to see if the link that you're making, if that makes sense to me. But I appreciate the question because there could be something there. And also, denomination is a key term which I should have referenced. Let's see, Kate. Can you explore what is the foundational master signifier? Is it the creator of the universe, Big Bang, or as Heidegger says, the one certainty is that each of us will die? Yeah, I mean, I want to say, like, you know, a master signifier in psychoanalysis is really, I guess the first master signifier is no. The first word of every language is no. And I'll unpack that, right? So first of all, this is interesting. Like, a language requires a minimum of 2 signifiers. A language doesn't exist with just one signifier, right? Because language is a signifier that references another signifier. So to have the most basic language is like binary language, off and on, high, low, fast, slow, right? That's a language, very basic language, on, off, binary. But you need the 2. You don't have a language with one signifier. A language only begins, as I say, when you have 2 signifiers that connect, and then a chain of signifiers. And the result of this is that there's a sense in which language has something within it that can never be fully articulated, right? So because language only gets going with 2 signifiers and more, there's a sense in which it never ends. It's always having to reinterpret backwards what the first signifier means. The first signifier has no meaning until there's a second signifier that references it. And language becomes, I'm going to very quickly tell this parable because it's a good parable, I think it brilliantly explains what signifiers are. It's a Chinese parable. Very quickly, if I can remember it, this man has 4 horses. And one night, the barn door opens and the 4 horses run off. And the neighbours come to the guy and they say, "This is so unfortunate." And the farmer says, maybe. Anyway, 3 weeks pass and the horses come back. Not only do they come back, but they bring 5 wild horses, wild stallions with them. And so the neighbours come round and go, "Oh my goodness, this is so fortunate." And the farmer says, "Oh, maybe. And then a month passes and his son is breaking one of the horses in, falls off the horse and badly breaks his leg. Neighbours go, "This is so unfortunate." The farmer says, maybe. And then a week later, some officials from the government come to his house to conscript young men into this war. But they see the son has a badly broken leg and they can't take him. And the neighbours, of course, come round and they say, "Oh, how fortunate." And the farmer says, maybe. And that's kind of how signifiers are, is that language, meaning doesn't click until the end of the sentence, the end of the paragraph, the end of life, right? There's a certain openness. This is how I think you can defend freedom over determinism, by the way. There's an inherent openness to language, precisely because of its signifying chain. And what that first signifier is the master signifier. The first signifier is, in a sense, doesn't have meaning until the next one comes along and it interprets it. So why do I say the first signifier is a no? Well, and you see this in the Bible, right? You shall, kind of in a sense, you shall not eat of the apple, right? There's a prohibition at the very beginning. But at the very beginning, the paternal function is a no, you cannot stay with your mother, right? A no, right? But it's a no without meaning. It's a rupture without sense. And then the child has to try to make sense of this prohibition. And it's not ever possible to fully make sense of it or fully whatever. So at the very beginning of language is a no, a prohibition, a no. I connect this with the name of God as the ultimate impossibility. And this connects, Kate, with what you're saying with Heidegger and death. Because death is nothingness, nothingness is lack, prohibition. They're all kind of interconnected. So the master signifier is that which has no meaning, but brings meaning, binds meaning. Like, as I say, the word God cannot be defined, but it generates endless conversations. So it generates meaning precisely because it cannot be grasped as itself meaningful. And I think God is a great master signifier. Question from Brad. There is a death drive that needs to be brought out and acknowledged, but is there not also a life drive? Does God encompass both, but religion lately has mostly focused on salvation and life? Yeah, I mean, Freud does talk about the life drives and the death drives, and that's a very interesting and complicated conversation that kind of developed from when Freud explored that in Beyond the Pleasure Principle onwards. The life drives are the eros, love, all of that. What theory has attempted to do is draw out how they're both not two opposites but completely intertwined. And maybe I'll do a whole talk on that actually, and not because I think it's a brilliant question. I think it's an important question. Is what I almost want to show is the death drive is what brings life. And I suppose I've hinted at that in this talk, is that the very lack, that we have, is what generates excess. It's what generates our creative impulses. It's what gets us to do things. So it's not so much that life drives and death drives are opposites. And Freud himself saw them as interconnected. At first he started by seeing them as kind of opposed, and then gradually started to go, well, no, they're not opposed. And then that gets further developed in Lacan, that this death drive, this lack, is the source of excess, of life, of vitality. And so the issue is not so much that we need space for the life drive and the death drive. It's more that we need to kind of orient ourselves differently to the death drive, as simultaneously the place of life. So anyway, your question is very good, and I think we should go deeper into that maybe next month or maybe next week in Coffee and Concepts. We could talk about that. I just want to look at your question one last time. Is there not also life? Does God encompass both? Religions lately most... Oh yeah, I wanted to comment on that last line. Religion lately has mostly focused on salvation and life. I just want to reference Luther, the importance of Luther here, because although Luther's very confessional, whatever, Luther, I think, grasps this idea that death is where life is. So Luther was the first to systematically see the death of God as the site of life, as the site of salvation, as the site of resurrection. And he called it, there was the theology of glory and the theology of, I forget what he called, the cross or the crucifixion, the theology of the passion. Forgive me for forgetting, but basically Luther was very, very critical of the theology of glory, which you can think of as life drives. For Luther, he was like, no, it's all about the death of Christ. But in embracing that death, that's where life is. Very dialectical. In order to live, you must die. You go fully into the death in order to live. So that's what I'll maybe explore more in the next question, or in the next session. I'm just going to do one more from Sean Whitty. Hello, Sean. Good to see you. There is an aspect of this which seems to echo Nick Cave's exploration of grief loss and religiosity without spirituality. He appears to attend Mass as a kind of observer. Does this feel familiar? Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, Barry Taylor, a friend of ours, many of you know, he's going to be at my Spark retreat. I think he's going to show a Nick Cave documentary, and we're going to talk precisely about the very things you brought up. Because one thing I was going to do in this talk and didn't is I wanted to give you patron saints of the different positions, and I want to give you a few patron saints of this latter position, and I'm going to throw Nick Cave in. I didn't think of Nick Cave, but I'm going to throw him in. Mother Teresa, I think, because in her diaries, her experience of radical loss of God becomes her spiritual presence with God. Nick Cave is another great patron saint of radical theology, and I'd recommend anybody to. There's a couple of documentaries about him and the loss of his. I think he's lost 2 children, and the grief that he has gone through. And he's a man of deep, dark spirituality. All right, thank you so much for joining me. This is really fun. I really appreciate you checking in, and hopefully, Hannah, you maybe hung around. I appreciate you being part of it. Good luck with the lecture that you're working on, and I will see some of you next Sunday. All right, take care. Bye-bye.